India's unemployment problem, made worse by the lockdowns imposed during the pandemic, is showing no signs of mitigation. It is evidenced by the job riots we saw earlier this year in Bihar and Uttar Pradesh during the railway recruitment process, by the considerably higher number of households demanding work under Manrega, by the millions of applications for government jobs that number in the tens or the hundreds, and by hard data. The latest from the CMI, the Center for Monitoring the Indian Economy, shows India's already low labor force participation falling further to 40%. This is your weekly fix. I'm Smita Nair. Let's speak to Mahesh Vyas, Managing Director and CEO of the Center for Monitoring the Indian Economy. Thanks for making the time, Mr. Vyas.
My pleasure.
Before you tell us how the numbers are tracking and how to interpret them, can you explain to our viewers what these three terms mean? Unemployment rate, labor force participation rate, and youth not in employment, education, or training. And in conjunction, do they provide us an understanding of the Indian economy?
So, I think the labor force participation rate is a very important indicator before we learn about the unemployment rate. The labor force participation rate is a proportion of the working age population. So, you have the working age population, which we nowadays consider as all those people who are of 15 years of age or more. So earlier, we used to stop at 65 years of age, but people are working more into their lifespan, and they don't retire very easily. So it's better for us to consider the working age population as all those people who are of 15 years of age and more. Now, from this is a proportion that is willing to go out and seek employment. So we all work. Even people who don't go for a job are working at home. But what we are looking at is that proportion which is saying that we are willing to go out and work for either pay, for a salary, or for generating some profit, directly or indirectly. But anyone who's looking for pay or profit and going out to seek that is seeking employment. Now, those people who are seeking employment are participating in the labor force. So these people, as a percentage of all the working age population, is the labor force participation rate. Okay. Now, from this labor force, all the people who are seeking employment for pay or profit, some of them get employment and some of them don't. So now, those people who don't get employment, as a percentage of all the people who are seeking employment, is your unemployment rate. So the labor force in India, for example, is about 40% of the total working age population. Of all the working age population, 40% are seeking employment. Of those 40% who are seeking employment, approximately 8% or so don't get employment. So that's it. 8% of the labor force is unemployed, which means that 92% are employed. And 40% of all the working age population are seeking employment.
And the what is referred to as NEET, is that sort of the youth that is neither employed, neither in education nor in training? Is that a sort of a subcategory?
So the term that we use is called out of labor force. So the 60% people who are not seeking employment are the out of the labor force. So NEET is used by people who use the NSSO survey, which is neither in employment nor in education, etc. But our survey is a little different. We say that there are people who are in education and are considering themselves to be employed. So I could be doing, let us say, an MA in economics, and I'm also employed. So I can be a student and I can also be employed. So the CMI survey captures this peculiarity of the labor force. There are lots of people of this kind who who are students and they're employed. So we don't classify people as neat. We just say you're either in the labor force or you're out of the labor force.
Okay, got it. Mr. Vyas, we're at the end of April 2022. What is the unemployment rate and labor force participation rate telling us as of today?
So the broad numbers we have already spoken a little bit about. The labor force participation rate is of the order of 40%. It has been declining. It used to be around 46% when we began the survey in 2016. It's now down to 40%. The unemployment rate is of the order of 8%. It goes up and comes down a little bit. It varies between 7.5 and 8.5%. So I'll say the unemployment rate in India is of the order of 8%.
Okay. Now, if you could sort of tell us a little more about the labor force participation data. I'm sure many of our viewers read that widely shared sort of Bloomberg article last week that quoted the CMI study. And I want to read from the headline. It said, majority of India's 900 million workforce stopped looking for jobs. More than half of the 900 million Indians of legal working age, roughly the population of the US and Russia combined, don't want a job, according to the CMI. Now, two questions, Mr. Vyas. One, does the headline sort of accurately capture what the study found? And the other question is on methodology, if I may. How is this actively opting out of the workforce number determined?
So I'd like to put it in my words, and we have described this earlier. There are about a billion people who are of the age 15 or more, and about 40% of them are seeking work, 60% are not seeking work. So in a sense, it's right that more than 50% people are not seeking work. But there's nothing unusual in this. Globally, the labor force participation rate is around 60% or a little more than 60%, but thereabouts, around 60%, which means globally 40% of the people are not a part of the labor force. They're not seeking employment. So we are much lower at 40%. So it is true that more than half the working age population is not seeking employment, but not that all these half people started not looking for employment only in the last few years. What has happened is we had a 46% labor force participation rate, which means 54% of the people who are not seeking employment. Now 60% are not seeking employment. The difference is only that much.
And why is that? I mean, have you looked at? I'm sure the reasons are vary, but why are we seeing a consistent drop in labor force participation rate? And how does India compare with, like, say, our neighbors or other developing economies?
We have, so this is a very complex subject. Broadly, the reason why our labor force participation rate is so low and why it is falling is because we have less women working. We have less women participating in the labor markets. Okay, so that's number one. Number two, the number of women or the proportion of women in the labor force is declining. This has been seen in the past in the government surveys as well, and we see it in our surveys also. Why is this declining? It's a very complex subject. It's something that researchers will find out and figure out what exactly is happening. But what the received wisdom so far is that there is an education impact. In the past, women used to be more on the fields, and now they are more in schools. So when they were in the fields and engaged in agricultural activities, we classified them as part of the labor force. Now that we require lesser people on the fields, these women have gone into education, which is a good thing to have happened. A fall in labor force participation rate, but not a bad thing to happen. And this happens to all economies as they develop. The second thing is there's an income effect. So as the household's incomes have been rising, the need for women to go out to look for work has dropped. So this also happens in all kinds of economies all over the world. It's happening in India as well. Then you have other things, that there are less jobs which are, into quotes, kinder to women. Women require safer, more convenient transportation. jobs which are closer to their residence. Because, mind you, women, all said and done, work in multiple shifts. They are the ones who take the largest burden at home, even today. They are the ones who are largely engaged in cooking and cleaning and caring and so on and so forth. And in addition to that, they have to go to work, or they choose to go to work. So it's a complex reason why women are dropping out of the labor force. When now, the additional thing I like to add over here is when there are economic shocks like demonetization, the implementation of GST, or more importantly, the pandemic and the lockdowns, when things become hard, it's the women who choose to stay home, and it's the men who go out in those difficult times to get employment.
Okay. There's also the subject of lack of quality jobs, I suppose. The frustration with not finding quality jobs is something perhaps that is also a factor in people opting out of the workforce.
Well, to be fair, men also require quality jobs as much as women do. So I think men and women are both willing to take hardship more or less equally. There are special cases that hurt women's employment. So the special cases are to do with safety and the need for those jobs to be closer to home. So if, for example, I live in Bombay, and in Bombay, a man can easily travel a very long distance, changing two trains and two buses to reach to work and get back home. But a woman may not be willing to do that because she may have responsibilities that require her to be back at home to, say, cook, take care of children, and so on and so forth. So it's that difficulty that makes women opt out of labor force. Quality jobs applies to both men and women.
Okay. Now, Mr. Vyas, a common sense sort of inference or a question from this, what seems like a dramatic fall in labor force participation numbers would be, how are people surviving? Sure, there were job riots earlier this year in Bihar and UP. But wouldn't there be widespread unrest in society with so many people out of jobs with meager or no savings? You explained this very effectively in your Rediff piece that I read, and I hope to link to it later on YouTube. Can you explain to our viewers what you talk about in that piece about looking at the household as a unit, and how that to some extent explains why we're not seeing widespread social unrest, perhaps, despite the high rates of unemployment and falling labor force participation?
So the first thing I'd like to make a small correction, at least give my view on the subject, is
Right.
that there were no job riots in Bihar and Uttar Pradesh.
Okay.
Those riots were to do with uh, a
Railway recruit.
misunderstanding of how many examinations do these aspirants have to get before they qualify to get a job. So they were rioting against the way the exams were being conducted or the delay in the results of the exams. They were not rioting to say we want jobs. So
But it is
I
certainly
have,
a
I've
factor, Mr. Vyas. The fact that there are so many applicants for so few jobs is certainly a
yes,
factor that goes into.
that is true. There are lots of applicants for very few jobs, is absolutely true. But the only point I'm making is that India does not see job riots.
All right. All
There are
right.
no job, I mean, there isn't that angst. And the reason is what I had explained in one of the pieces I had written is that uh, earlier, so households are not as stressed because of lack of jobs. What has happened is that the proportion of households where two or more members were working has declined. And the proportion of those that have only one person working increased. So what has happened is that in the face of lower supply of jobs, systematically households seem to have kind of said that one of the members of the households will take a hit, but the other one, if there are only two, cannot take the hit. So presumably, and I think there's some evidence to this as well, that one person continues to work even if it is at a lower wage rate, but the other person steps out of the labor force when the wage rate dips. So as the wage rate was falling, as the supply of jobs was inadequate, we saw lesser people being employed and still households having some means of surviving. So the stake in society to say at least one person of the household is getting a job, at least some income is coming in. So rioting is not a good option. It is good that at least this one person is getting something for us to get by.
Okay, Mr. Vyas, there's a question one of our viewers had emailed me earlier, and I'm just reading that question out to you. She asks, is the pandemic the sole or key reason for the crisis in the employment market? What was the situation like before the pandemic hit? Do the roots of the current job crisis go further back? I'm referring here to ill thought out policy decisions plus existing structural issues.
So I don't know what you call a crisis. Uh, so I call a crisis not as an event. We don't have in India an employment crisis as an event. So there isn't a calamity where people have lost jobs in a big way and we have great stress at home. That's not happening in India, at least
You
not
didn't
so far.
even say that happened during the pandemic, 2020, 2021. I mean, that seemed to be the characterization by economists. I mean, the number of jobs that were lost in the course of the lockdown.
So we measured that. So there was a huge fall in employment in the months of April and May. Huge. But mind you, what is the meaning of that loss of employment? One needs to understand that. Huge numbers of jobs were lost. But what happened is that, let us say I was employed by CMI and I didn't lose my job. But the vegetable vendor who used to come and sell vegetables could not sell vegetables anymore. He lost his employment. The plumber who used to come and fix the faucet could not come and fix the faucet. He lost employment. The cart pusher in the markets lost employment because there were no markets open. Jobs were not lost. The jobs were actually taken away because we clamped down a lockdown. We just said that even if you do have a cart to push, even if you do have all the tools to go and fix the faucet, even if you have everything that you need to go and there's somebody's faucet which is leaking, you still can't go and fix it. These were the jobs or employment sources that were lost. The moment the lockdown was eased out, Mr. Plumber could come and fix my faucet. Mr. Cart Pusher could push his cart. Mr. Vegetable Vendor could go and sell his vegetables. So it was a lockdown effect, like a switch off and switch on. People who had salaried jobs did not lose their jobs in a big way in that pandemic. The crisis that India has is not the crisis of the pandemic lockdown. The crisis that India has is a systematic falling employment opportunity. Systematically, as lesser and lesser investments happen compared to how much they should, we have lesser opportunities for jobs. So our crisis, in a sense, is not an event. It's a continuing process of inadequate investments and inadequate jobs and inadequate good quality jobs.
So structural issues largely, net
It's structural.
is the answer, right? I also want to sort of remind our viewers, you would recall the journalist Somesh Jha in his Business Standard article in 2019. He had put this out in the public domain, the findings of the NSSO report. You would remember that the government had tried to sort of thwart the release of that report, which showed that India's unemployment rate in 2017-18 was the worst in over 4 decades. And to partially, if I may answer the question I asked Mr. Vyas, this was the first data set that sort of comprehensively captured the job scenario in India post demonetization. This 2017-18 NSSO report. All right, that's quite a few questions are coming in from our viewers as well. Something, a comment that you had made in the recent past, Mr. Vyas, and I want you to sort of elaborate on that, if you will. The median age in India is 28, compared to that, say, China, the median age is 37. Now, you for those who are sort of who need to sort of be reminded of what demographic dividend really means, it means that having more people in working age as compared to those who are dependents. And this, by any measure, is expected to give an economy a competitive edge. Now, in an article recently, you are one of the people who are quoted, Mr. Vyas, and you say that you sort of sound a warning. You say that we run the risk of this demographic dividend turning into demographic demon. Um, can you sort of elaborate what you foresee as potentially happening?
Well, I must have said that really a long time ago because I've stopped talking of the demographic dividend by now.
Earlier this
So,
year, I think, sir, if I'm not wrong, January
okay,
20.
so
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
I write a weekly column, so
yeah.
yes. So if we there is this large young population uh, which provides the country an opportunity to turn this into a dividend. So it's a demographic dividend. Every country has a demographic dividend. It comes once in a lifetime, once in many centuries. So when the young age population is very large, there's a bulge in the pyramid of population pyramid that we see, where we have a large number of people in the age group of the 20s and early 30s. These are the people who, if employed, will generate a lot more income, will generate a lot more prosperity. And the best part is that they can't consume all that. They are going to save it. And that savings is critically important when the population pyramid kind of narrows down and you have more older age people. Like Kerala, for example, has a less bulge. The southern states have got a lesser bulge in the younger age population. The northern states have that bulge. That North India requires large amounts of employment, and there is inadequate employment over there compared to the Bulgarian population, and therefore the North Indians have to travel to South India to find jobs where there are lesser young age people. Now, if we have situations where we become anti-migrants, like it happened during the pandemic time, or we become anti-outsiders, it will rob that bulge to get those jobs. If we don't, then these unemployed people will become restless, and that restlessness can take the shape of a demon. So we should be not only taking advantage of the young age population that we have got, but we should also be wary of a possible restlessness turning into a demon.
And a bit of that sort of anti-migrant or anti-outsider sentiment has been legitimized, even legalized by governments passing executive orders, reserving jobs for locals who
Well,
have.
that's the pressure. You see, that's the pressure. The political pressure is the pressure of employment or lack of employment is felt by the politicians. And therefore, uh, almost all political parties are pressured into promising the electorate that they will give jobs when they come to power. Now, many of them come to power and see the reality of their finances and then kind of shuffle and do not actually manage to give jobs. But then at some point, this breaks, and a state like Haryana has to then say, okay, we promise that we'll give jobs only to the locals. That's all political pressure because of lack of jobs.
Right. Mr. Vyas, one final question from me before we take a couple of questions from our viewers. Whatever we're saying, it follows that if there is a glut of job seekers and a corresponding and an inverse proportion of jobs out there in the market, um, my ability as a job seeker to negotiate for better working conditions and pay will be dramatically reduced, and nobody's really talking about that.
That is true. So there's a little nuance over here, but nevertheless, broadly and most importantly, you're right that as the number of jobs reduce, the negotiating power of labor reduces. So they are just takers of whatever is available, and that's what's happening. The wage rates are not growing adequately on an average aggregate basis. So there is pressure over there. At the same time, the nuance I want to bring in over here is that uh, there is great demand for skilled labor in India, and there is inadequate supply of that skilled labor. So it's also a failure of our education system that it is unable to provide the kind of labor that we require today. You look at the stress that the IT companies are facing in their inability to acquire the number of IT professionals they require. The same goes for salespeople. So some skills of white collar workers is in short supply, is in serious short supply. At the same time, there's the huge masses of people who are not adequately skilled, not adequately educated. That's more important. And therefore, they're not able to find jobs and they face a huge wage challenge.
Right. I'm just going to take a quick few questions from our viewers here. Anupama has written in, and she's maybe it would require you to sort of explain what you were trying to say. She says, what jobs are these young people of the demographic dividend going to get? How are they going to earn so much that they won't even consume it and thus drive up savings? I don't think she quite got what you were trying to say. My question to you was, in fact, to elaborate on an earlier comment you had made on how the demographic dividend could turn into a demographic demon. She says, can you explain this? You're only stating that this could potentially happen. How we could reap demographic dividends, but how are these people going to get jobs? I mean, that's not a question you can possibly answer, but a comment nevertheless.
Well, they should get jobs, is what demographic dividend says. And if they do get the jobs, then we have a dividend which will pay us in our old age. But if they don't, and that's what I was worrying about, then they'll become demons.
Right.
How will they
Uh,
get job if there is more investment, if companies invest aggressively to hire more people? So 91, 92 liberalization, we saw private sector making large investments into new capacities, and a whole lot of people got new jobs which are unforeseen, which are not foreseen earlier in the financial markets, in the IT industry. The IT industry was non-existent of this kind before 91, 92. So 91, 92 created jobs in IT, in financial markets, in entertainment. None of these jobs were there, even manufacturing. For example, the two-wheeler industry, the automobile industry, the electronics industry, these jobs are all post 91, 92. So we require a large liberalization of the Indian economy to motivate private sector to invest in a big way and grab the opportunity provided by this huge labor available in India today.
okay. Amol Patiala writes to ask, what percentage of people not seeking employment go back to agriculture or self-employment? Do you have like a broad strokes sort of an
Well,
approximation of?
if people go back to agriculture or self-employment, we consider them employed. So that's part
Oh,
of the 40%. It's only when you say I'm sitting at home doing nothing, I'm going to become a homemaker.
right.
Because if you're going back to agriculture or self-employment, you are engaged in profits. So if you're engaged in an activity that gives you salaries, pay, or profits, then you're employed.
Right, but some economists do look at the labor force going back to agriculture as retrogression. They say that they already fragmented land holdings, more and more people. So if people moving from agriculture to manufacturing or other sectors is seen as progress
You are
and not
right.
the other one. Correct.
You're absolutely right. I was just explaining a technical point, but the elaboration to the question was that if they're going back to agriculture, it's often, not always, often disguised unemployment. So I lost my job in the city. I go back home. At home is a farm, and I shovel some mud over there, etc., and I claim I'm doing farming. So that's disguised unemployment.
Right. Kamal K. Anand is asking if you could talk about regional and sectoral variations when it comes to unemployment rate.
It's very, very varied. So there's nothing which can pinpoint. And there's one more problem. If you talk of unemployment rate, you're looking at a very finicky number. So, for example, I had I had big stress when there were elections going on recently in Uttar Pradesh and other states. The very high unemployment rate in Haryana caught the attention of the chief minister and was pretty annoyed with the number being so high. And at the same time, there was Uttar Pradesh on the side, which had very low unemployment bias. So Haryana was showing 24% unemployment rate. Uttar Pradesh was saying some 2 to 3% unemployment rate. These are huge variations. It depends upon the labor force participation rate. So what matters is what the employment rate is. So I don't think it's entirely useful to look at the unemployment rate state-wise. But the employment by sector, I will say that agriculture is attracting a lot more labor because there are no job opportunities in other places. Manufacturing is suffering in a big way, and there's an increase in jobs in services sector, certain kinds like retail. Your Swiggy delivery boys is a big increase in employment, overtaking a lot of the loss of employment in services because of tourism and travel and so on and so forth. It's a little more complex. It's not clean like employment going out from here and going in there.
Right. Sheikh Iqbal wants to talk about the reasons for the economic slowdown, perhaps, but we'll take that some other time. Not a question that Mr. Vyas would particularly want to answer. Um, right. Largely, all questions centered around how is this going to be addressed. Inadequate research funding for fueling future job creation. That's certainly a comment. Skilled labor is free. We don't have the opportunity or salary. Younger generation not trained. Training is something that we've seen regularly when we talk about employment, is a comment that comes as well. Mohammed Waqif Amin Hussain asks, is entrepreneurship initiatives such as startup policies key to solving the unemployment crisis in your opinion? Quick final question, Mr. Vyas, before we let you go.
So, I think what's more important is this startup thing, or some others like skilling or help startup, etc., are patchwork. They're like band-aid over a serious wound or a serious ailment you have. I don't think they help really. What's required is, like I said earlier, huge investments of the kind that we had post 91, 92. That's what we need. We need all the large industrialists to feel, and even the foreign industrialists to feel, that India is the place to go and invest. And not because there's a PLI scheme, but because it's just a great place to go and invest and produce more cars, more textiles, more shoes, more whatever else. So, till that doesn't happen, we're not going to actually make much progress. So, we require really aggressive, good quality investments by good quality companies.
All right, we'll leave it there for the moment. Mr. Vyas, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you to your viewers as well.